Elias Whitaker pressed his dead wife's locket against his chest, so hard the metal left a mark, and then he walked outside and nailed a sign to his gate with shaking hands, telling himself it meant nothing. It meant everything, because 3 days later, a woman appeared on that road with bleeding feet and hollow eyes, and the most feared gunslinger in Montana territory had no idea his whole life was about to change. If this story moves you, subscribe and drop your city below. I want to see how far this one travels. The locket hit the floor before Elias even realized his hand had opened. He stared at it for a long moment, the small oval of tarnished silver lying face down on the kitchen floorboards, and he didn't pick it up. He just stood there in the middle of the room, breathing like a man who had run a great distance and arrived somewhere worse than where he started. It was August, Montana summer. The kind of heat that didn't cool down after sundown, that pressed itself against the walls of the cabin like something alive, something patient. He hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days, not because there was no food. There was food, dried beans in a tin, a half-wheel of hard cheese, strips of salted jerky he'd bought in town 3 weeks ago and hadn't finished. His body was still functioning, his hands still worked. His legs still carried him from the barn to the well to the back fence and back again. But somewhere between waking up and going to sleep, he had stopped believing that eating mattered. He was 51 years old. His wife Margaret had been dead for 6 years. His daughter, Rose, 8 years old, with her mother's laugh and his stubborn jaw, had been gone for 6 years and 3 weeks. They died within 12 days of each other. The illness came fast, the way bad things always did, and he had stood outside the doctor's door both times and been told there was nothing more to do. He had walked out of that town and never gone back. Built this ranch with his own hands in the valley between 2 low mountains where nobody could find him easily. Raised cattle, repaired fences, slept badly, woke up and did it again. That was the whole of it. That was the entire shape of his days. And now he was standing in his kitchen, looking at a locket on the floor and finally admitting something out loud that he had been refusing to say for 6 years. I can't keep doing this alone. His voice was rough from disuse. He barely recognized it. He picked up the locket, held it for another moment. Then he tucked it back into his breast pocket, went to the barn, pulled out a plank of scrap wood, and found a piece of charcoal. He wrote the words slowly, pressing hard, "Cook wanted. Shelter provided." He nailed it to the gatepost at the end of the road with 4 iron nails and a hammer he swung harder than necessary. When he was done, he stood back and looked at the sign and felt something close to humiliation. Because Elias Whitaker had once been the most feared man in 3 counties. Men had crossed the street when they saw him coming. Sheriffs had asked for his help and then asked him to leave. Bar fights ended before they started when someone recognized his face. He had been faster than fast, the kind of fast that didn't seem real until you'd seen it, and he had used that speed in ways that still came back to him in the hour before dawn. He had done things he couldn't undo, and now he was standing at his own gate asking the world to please send someone to cook his meals. He went back inside. He didn't look at the sign again. For 3 days nobody came. He told himself this was fine. He didn't need anyone. He'd been stupid to think otherwise. The ranch was too far from town. The sign was a mistake. He pulled out the jerky and ate it without tasting it and went to sleep in the chair by the fire, because the bed still smelled like Margaret even after all this time, and some nights he couldn't make himself lie down in it. On the morning of the 4th day, he was out by the back fence mending a broken post when he heard something. Not a horse, not a wagon, footsteps. He straightened up slow, one hand dropping to the revolver on his hip the way it always did, the way it probably always would no matter how many years passed. He turned. There was a figure coming up the road from the south. Walking alone, his eyes narrowed. It was a woman. Young mid-20s maybe. Dressed in a faded calico dress that had once been blue and was now the color of old sky. Her hair was dark, tied back with a strip of cloth that had come half loose. She was carrying a bag, more of a bundle, really a piece of cloth tied at the corners, and she was walking like someone who had been walking for a very long time. And she was barefoot, On the dry, cracked ground of a Montana August, with the rocks and the hardpan and the thorned brush along the edges of the road, she was walking in bare feet. Elias didn't move. He watched her approach the gate. Watched her stop. Watched her read the sign. She stood there for a moment, perfectly still. Then she pushed the gate open and walked through. He called out before she reached the porch. "That's far enough." She stopped. She looked at him across the yard, and she didn't flinch. He'd spoken to men twice her size in that tone and had them step backward. She just looked at him the way someone looks at weather, assessing, calm, accepting what she finds. "Sign says cook wanted," she said. Her voice was steady. A little raw, like someone who hadn't spoken much recently either. "Sign says that," he confirmed. "I can cook. You got experience?" "Enough." He looked at her feet. The bottoms were dark with road dust and cracked along the heels, and there was blood, dried and fresh, both on her right sole where something had cut her. "Where are you coming from?" He said. "South. That's not a place." "It's the direction I came from," she said. "It's the most I can tell you right now." He should have turned her away. He knew it even then. A young woman alone. No shoes. No horse. No clear origin. She was either in trouble or bringing it with her. Either way, she was a complication, and Elias Whitaker had been very careful for 6 years to stay uncomplicating himself out of every situation that could matter. He looked at her feet again, the fresh blood, the long road she'd walked to get here. Something moved in his chest, something that had been very still for a very long time. "Can you make a proper stew?" he said. She blinked. "Biscuits?" "Yes." "Without burning them?" Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, almost. "I have never burned a biscuit in my life." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the cabin and said, over his shoulder, "There's a pump around the side of the house. Wash your feet before you come inside." Her name was Clara Bennett. He didn't ask her for it that first day. She told him herself, plainly, when she came inside and he pointed her toward the kitchen. "Clara Bennett," she said, "in case you needed to know who was cooking your food." "Elias," he said. He didn't offer the last name. She didn't ask for it. She looked at the kitchen the way a person looks at a problem they've already decided to solve. She opened the shelves. She checked the stove. She found the tin of beans and the dried onions hanging from a hook near the window and a half-empty sack of cornmeal behind the door. "I'll need more than this," she said. "Town's 7 miles east." "Is there a garden?" He almost laughed. It came out like a short exhale through his nose. There was one. "Where?" he told her. She went outside and stood at the edge of what had once been Margaret's kitchen garden, a patch of earth now baked and empty, and looked at it for a moment. Then she came back inside. "I can work with what you have tonight," she said. "Tomorrow I'd like to talk about the garden. You're assuming you're staying past tonight." She looked at him steadily. "Are you planning to tell me to leave?" He didn't answer. She took that as a no and turned back to the stove. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched her work. She didn't perform. She didn't try to impress him. She just worked quietly, efficiently, with the focused economy of someone who had cooked in worse conditions than this and expected to cook in worse again. She soaked the beans. She reconstituted the dried onions in a little water. She found a small piece of salt pork he'd forgotten about in a tin under the counter and added it to the pot. She made cornbread in a cast-iron skillet, checking it twice, turning it at exactly the right moment. The smell that came out of that kitchen was not sophisticated. But it was real, and it was warm. Elias sat outside on the front step while she cooked, listening to the sounds of someone moving through his house, and felt a weight in his chest that he couldn't immediately name. It took him until the food was on the table to understand what it was. It was the weight of having forgotten what this felt like. He sat down across from her. She had set 2 places without asking, without hesitating, and looked at the bowl in front of him. Bean stew, cornbread. Nothing special. Everything. He picked up the spoon. "You going to ask me why I was walking barefoot?" she said. No. She watched him. "I'm curious," he said. "I'm not asking." She was quiet for a moment. "Most people ask. Most people want an answer that makes them feel better about whatever decision they've already made," he said. I already made my decision. She looked at him across the table. Something in her expression shifted, subtle, careful, like a door opening just a crack. What was your decision, she said. That you're here, he said. That's enough for tonight. She nodded slowly. She looked down at her food. And just for a second, just one brief, unguarded second, he saw the exhaustion under the steadiness, the weight she was carrying the way he carried his own, tucked in close where most people couldn't see it. He looked away, let her have it. They ate in silence. And the empty chair at the far end of the table, the one he'd left there for 6 years, the one he never moved, the one he sometimes still looked at in the dark hours before morning, was still there. But the table didn't feel as empty as it had. He didn't know what to do with that. He pushed back from the table, took his bowl to the counter, and stood there for a moment with his back to her. Room's off the back hall, he said. Small, there's a cot. Thank you. I start work at first light. I don't expect breakfast until I'm back from the barn. Understood. You stay out of my things, of course. And if you're planning to disappear in the night, leave the door unlocked behind you. The latch sticks. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not planning to disappear. He nodded once. Then he went to his chair by the fire and sat down and didn't look at her again. He heard her clean up the kitchen, heard the soft sounds of water in the basin, the clatter of dishes, the squeak of the cabinet door. Then her footsteps down the hall, the soft close of the back room door. Then silence. Elias Whitaker sat alone in his chair by the fire and stared into the coals and tried to remember the last time someone else had made a sound in this house. He couldn't. He closed his eyes. For the first time in longer than he could measure, the silence didn't feel like punishment. Morning came the way Montana mornings did in August, sudden and bright and merciless. Elias was at the barn before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, moving through his routine with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had performed the same tasks so many times they no longer required thought. He was halfway through mucking the stalls when he heard the back door of the cabin. He didn't stop working, but he listened, heard the pump running. The back step, movement in the kitchen. When he came inside 90 minutes later, there was coffee on the stove and a plate covered with a cloth on the table. He lifted the cloth, fried eggs, toast from the cornbread leftovers, pan-crisped. A small dish of the salt he kept in the cabinet. He stood there for a moment. Then he sat down and ate. She appeared from the back hallway as he was finishing, dressed for work, her hair already pinned up. Morning, she said, morning. She moved into the kitchen without ceremony, began taking inventory of what was there. He watched her open cabinets with a focused, practical attention, like she was mapping the territory. I'll need to go to town, she said. You'll need to wait until I go. When do you go? When I need to. She turned and looked at him. If I'm going to cook actual meals, I need actual provisions. Flour, lard, salt, fresh vegetables if there are any. I can make a list. You don't need to make a list. I know what to buy. I'd rather make the list. He looked at her. She looked at him. Fine, he said. Make the list. She found a scrap of paper. She wrote carefully in a clear hand without excess. When she was done, she set it on the table in front of him. He picked it up. Read it. It was exactly what she'd said, practical, nothing unnecessary. No luxuries, no waste. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. You read and write, he said. Yes. He didn't ask more than that. But she answered anyway. I had schooling until I was 14. After that I educated myself. He nodded, stood up. Reached for his hat. I'll be going to town Thursday. That's 3 days. That's 3 days, he confirmed. He picked up his hat. There's a patch of ground behind the south garden gets afternoon shade. If you want to start digging it up. She turned. For planting? Thought you wanted a garden. Something passed across her face, quick, unguarded, the same thing he'd seen the night before. Something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite disbelief and was somehow both at once. I do, she said. Tools are in the shed. Don't touch the rifle hanging inside the door. Everything else is fair use. He put his hat on and went out. He spent the rest of the morning at the far fence line, pretending he couldn't hear the sounds of digging from behind South Garden wall. By the third evening, something had changed in the house. Elias couldn't have named exactly what it was. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even visible, not really, but it was there. The kitchen shelf was organized differently, not wrong. Just different, the way someone else's hand always arranges things slightly differently than your own. There was a bunch of dried wildflowers stuck into an old tin cup on the windowsill. She'd found them somewhere along the property. He didn't ask where. The front step had been swept. The rag by the pump had been replaced with a clean one. Small things, invisible things almost, but they were the signs of another person inhabiting the same space, and Elias had been alone long enough that each one of them hit him somewhere he wasn't prepared for. He was sitting on the porch after supper when she came and stood in the doorway. "The stove needs a new seal on the left door," she said. "The heat's leaking. I know. When are you fixing it?" He looked out at the valley. "When I get around to it." She was quiet. "Then if I knew how to do it, I'd fix it myself." "I'll show you." She looked at him. "You'd show me?" "It's not difficult. I'll show you tomorrow." She leaned against the doorframe. "You don't talk much." "No. Does that bother you that I've noticed?" He thought about it. "No, I don't talk much either," she said. "Usually, around people I don't trust. You trust me," he said. "I'm still deciding," she said, "but I trust you more than most." He almost said that's not hard to achieve. He didn't. "Get some sleep," he said instead. "We start the garden properly tomorrow." She went inside. He sat alone on the porch for a long time, listening to the valley go quiet. And he thought about what it meant, this woman, arriving out of nowhere, taking up space in his house, rearranging his shelves, planting wildflowers in tin cups, and how none of it felt like an intrusion. That was the thing that troubled him, not her presence. The absence of trouble with her presence. He should have been agitated. He should have been watching her sideways, calculating what she wanted, waiting for the angle. That was how he'd moved through the world since Margaret died. Guarded, suspicious, closed. But there was something about Clara Bennett that didn't trigger any of those defenses. And he didn't know yet if that meant she was exactly what she appeared to be, or if she was the most dangerous person who had ever walked through his gate. Thursday came. He went to town. He didn't take her. She didn't argue about it, which surprised him. She just handed him the list and went back to the garden, and he rode the 7 miles into Ridgecross alone the way he always did, his hat low, his eyes forward, hoping nobody would want to talk. Ridgecross was small. One main street, a general store, a saloon, a livery, a church at the East End that nobody attended regularly. The kind of town that had started as something and never quite committed to becoming anything more. Elias tied his horse outside the general store and went in. Franklin, who ran the store, was a stout man with a careful disposition. He knew Elias the way most people in Ridgecross knew him, warily, respectfully, and at a slight distance. "Whitaker," he said. "Franklin." Elias handed over the list. Franklin read it, looked up. "This is a lot of flour." Apparently. Franklin started pulling the items. He didn't ask questions. That was one of the things Elias respected about him. But the man at the counter to Elias's left wasn't Franklin. He was a rancher from north of town, stocky, red-faced, a man named Greer who had opinions about most things and the vocal volume to ensure everyone heard them. "Hear you got a woman out at your place," Greer said. Elias didn't look at him. "That right. Word travels." "Young woman. Arrived on foot, they're saying. They're saying that." "Seems strange," Greer said. "Man like you taking in a stray." Elias kept his eyes on the counter. "Hired a cook," he said. "That's all. Just a cook," Greer said. The way he said it made the words ugly. Elias turned his head then and looked at the man. Not fast. Not threatening. Just slow and direct and completely without expression. Greer stopped talking. "Just a cook," Elias said again quietly. He turned back to the counter. Franklin set his parcels down, totaled the price, received payment, and said nothing else. Elias loaded the supplies and rode back. When he got home, Clara was on the porch. She stood up when she saw the supplies on the horse. "You got everything," she said. "Everything on the list." "The pepper?" "The pepper." She came down the steps and started helping him unload without being asked. They carried the supplies inside in 2 trips, working around each other in the narrow kitchen doorway, with the ease of people who had been sharing space for weeks, rather than days. When everything was put away, she stopped and looked at him. "Something happened in town," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, you came back different. I came back the same as always." "You came back angry," she said. "Quietly angry. That's different from your regular quiet." He looked at her. "You've known me 4 days. I've met a lot of men who were quietly angry," she said. "I know the shape of it." He took off his hat, set it on the hook by the door, went to the table and sat down. After a moment, she came and sat across from him. "Was it about me?" she said. He didn't answer. "I see," she said. She looked down at the table. "People talking. People talk." "I've had people talk about me before," she said. "It doesn't require protecting." "I wasn't protecting anything," he said. "I corrected a misstatement." She looked up at him. "What kind of misstatement?" "The kind that implied your situation here was something other than employment." She was quiet for a moment. "And you cared about correcting it." "I care about accuracy," he said. "Elias," he looked at her. "Thank you," she said. He stood up, picked up his hat again. "Don't thank me for doing the obvious thing." He went back out to the barn. And if there was something warm in his chest that he didn't want to examine too closely, he buried it under the sound of the horses and the smell of hay and the familiar labor of a man who has decided, very firmly, that he is not the kind of person to whom good thing has happened twice. On the 6th night it rained, not Montana sprinkle rain. Real rain, the heavy, sustained kind that turned the yard to mud and drummed on the cabin roof like it had a message to deliver. Elias sat by the fire. He'd been reading or trying to. The same page for 20 minutes. Clara came out of the back hallway and stood in the doorway of the main room, which she didn't usually do. She'd been careful about that, about maintaining the invisible line between what was hers and what was his. "I can't sleep in rain," she said. "Mind if I sit out here?" He looked up from the page he hadn't been reading. "It's a house," he said. "You don't have to ask." She brought a chair from the corner, not the empty chair, not Margaret's chair. She had never once sat in that chair or even touched it, and he didn't know if she'd sensed something or was just being cautious. But either way, he was grateful, and she sat near the fire, not close to him at an angle. She had a piece of mending with her. They sat like that in silence for a long time, the rain working itself out against the roof, the fire doing what fires do. "Were you always quiet?" she said eventually. "No," he said. "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment, lost. She nodded slowly. She kept her eyes on the mending. "That'll do it. You?" She looked up. "Was I always quiet?" "Yeah," she thought about it. "I was a talker when I was small. My mother said I came out talking and hadn't stopped to pause. Then she died. I was 9, and I suppose I started choosing more carefully what was worth saying." "What was she like?" he said. He surprised himself by asking. She surprised herself by answering. Tall, laughed easy. Made everything feel less serious than it was. She had this way of walking into a room that made the room feel bigger. She paused again. "I've never figured out how she did that." He looked at the fire. "My wife was like that," he said. Margaret, Clara went still. "She could walk into a room and it was just lighter," he said. "I used to say she was made of different material than the rest of us." "That's a beautiful thing to say." She would have said I was being ridiculous and then laughed for 5 minutes, he said. And something happened on his face, not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of the shape of one. Something that had once been a smile, remembering itself. Clara watched him without speaking. The rain kept coming. After a while he said, "She's been gone 6 years." "I know," Clara said softly. "I can see it." He looked at her. "The chair," she said. She didn't point, just held his gaze. "I don't touch it." He nodded slowest. "Some things shouldn't be moved until the person's ready to move them," she said. "That's not for anyone else to decide." He looked back at the fire. The silence between them was a different kind now. Not the careful silence of strangers, something else. Something that had weight and texture, that meant they had been honest with each other, in a way that was hard to take back. "Why were you walking barefoot?" he said. It came out before he decided to say it. She was quiet for a moment. "My shoes wore out 2 towns back," she said. "I didn't have the money to replace them, and I needed to eat more than I needed to avoid blisters." A pause. "Priorities. Where were you going?" "Nowhere specific." "Somewhere they'd take me." "From what?" She looked at him carefully. "Testing something." Then she made her decision. "I worked for a family 3 counties south," she said. "For 4 years, room, board, wages. The husband was decent. The wife was complicated, but it was stable. And then the husband died and the wife's brother came to settle things, and he decided the household needed reorganizing." She said it flatly, evenly. The way people speak about things they've processed until the sharpest edges are worn down, but the weight is still there. "I was given until morning." Elias said nothing, but the line of his jaw tightened. "So I left," she said. "I kept walking. I worked where I could. Some places were decent, some weren't. And then I was in a bad stretch and I'd been walking for 11 days and I came around a bend in the road and there was a gate with a sign on it." She paused. "And I thought, what's the worst that happens? He turns me away. And the worst would have been fine. I was already used to fine being pretty bad." The fire popped, a log shifted. "But he didn't turn me away," she said quietly. "No," Elias said. She looked at the mending in her hands. "Why not?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Your feet," he said finally. She looked up. "I saw your feet," he said, and I thought." He stopped. Started again. "I thought anyone who'd walk that far on feet in that condition must have a very good reason for needing somewhere to land." He paused. "And I thought about what it feels like to have nowhere to land." Clara looked at him across the firelight. The rain came down. Neither of them said anything else for a long time. But when she finally went to bed that night, the invisible line between what was hers and what was his had shifted, not crossed, not gone, but moved. Just slightly. Enough, and Elias sat by the dying fire and held the locket in his palm, and for once didn't feel like he was holding it goodbye. He felt like he was holding it hello, like maybe it was possible, maybe, and he wasn't committing to anything, not yet. Not close to yet, that the life that had happened to him was not the only life that could still happen. The rain eased. He closed his hand around the locket. And somewhere in the back of his chest, so quietly he almost missed it, something that had been very still for a very long time took one slow, careful breath. The morning after the rain, Elias found a pot of coffee waiting and Clara already outside. Not in the garden, not near the shed. She was standing at the far edge of the property, at the place where the yard met the open grass, looking out at nothing in particular. She had her arms crossed loosely, and her face slid slightly upward, the way a person looks when they're trying to decide something. He poured his coffee and watched her through the kitchen window for a moment. Then he went outside. She heard him coming and didn't turn around. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Slept fine," she said. "Just thinking about whether this is real." He stood beside her. Drank his coffee. "What part of it?" "All of it." She finally turned and looked at the cabin behind them, the weathered walls, the repaired step, the tin cup of dried wildflowers visible through the kitchen window. "Places like this don't just appear, not for people like me." "People like you," he said flatly. "People who've been moving too long," she said. "You stop believing in something staying still." He didn't say anything to that. But he stayed where he was, and that was a kind of answer. After a moment, she turned back toward the cabin. "I'll start breakfast," she said. "Clara," she stopped. He looked at the open grass, the wet ground from last night's rain, the fence line stretching south. "This place is real," he said. "As real as anything I've got." She stood there for just a beat. She said quietly. Then she went inside, and Elias finished his coffee alone and felt the strange, unsteady sensation of a man who has said something true out loud that he wasn't entirely sure he believed until he heard himself say it. The day moved forward the way days do when two people are finding the rhythm of each other, without realizing they're doing it. She worked the garden. He worked the fence line on the western edge that had been pulling loose from the posts for weeks. At noon she brought him a sandwich without being asked, bread she'd baked that morning, sliced meat, a smear of the mustard she'd found in the back of the cabinet, and set it on the fence post beside him and walked back without requiring conversation. He ate it standing up, looking at the grass, and thought about the last time anyone had done that. He couldn't remember. In the afternoon, she found him in the shed. "The stove seal," she said from the doorway. "You said you'd show me." "I said I'd show you tomorrow. It's tomorrow now." He looked at her. Then he set down what he was holding and went inside. It took 20 minutes. The seal was a simple replacement. He had spare material on a shelf, a basic repair he'd been putting off for no real reason, except that there had been no real reason to rush. He talked her through it while she did the work herself, her hands careful and quick, following his instructions with focused attention. "Press harder on that corner," he said. She pressed harder. "Good. It's not as hard as I expected," she said. "Most things aren't," he said. "You just need someone to show you once." She sat back and looked at her work. "Did someone show you once?" "My father," he said. "He was good with his hands. Fixed everything himself. Said if a man couldn't maintain his own property, he didn't deserve to own it." "Sounds like a hard standard." "He was a hard man," Elias said. "But fair." She turned and looked at him. "Did you always want a ranch?" "No," he said, and he surprised himself again by continuing. "I wanted to run. That's all I knew how to do when I was young." "Be faster, go farther, get there first." He paused. "It took me a long time to understand there's no prize waiting when you arrive." She was quiet. "Then what made you stop running?" "Margaret," he said simply. The name landed in the room the way it always did, not heavy, not sharp, but present. Like weather that had already passed but left the ground changed. "She saw something in you worth staying for," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "She saw something I didn't know was there," he said. "That's different." Clara looked at the repaired stove seal. "Not as different as you think," she said softly. He didn't ask her what she meant by that. He thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. 3 days later, Elias rode into Ridgecross for fence supplies. He tied his horse outside the general store and was inside for less than 10 minutes. But when he came out, there were 2 men leaning against the post in front of the saloon across the street, watching him with the particular kind of attention that had nothing to do with curiosity. He recognized one of them. His name was Roy Dunbar. He'd ridden with Calvin Mercer's outfit 6 years ago, before Elias had left the territory, before he'd built the ranch, back in the years he preferred not to think about. Dunbar was lean and watchful, with pale eyes that never seemed to blink quite the right amount. Elias loaded his supplies without changing his pace. He didn't look at them again, but as he untied his horse, he heard boots crossing the dirt street. Whitaker. He didn't turn around. Whitaker. Closer now. He turned. Dunbar stopped 6 feet away. The other man, younger, someone Elias didn't recognize, hung back. "Roy," Elias said. "Been a while," Dunbar said. He smiled, which made him look less friendly, not more. "Didn't know you were still out this way." "Still out this way," Elias said. "Heard you built a ranch." Settled down, Dunbar looked him up and down in the manner of a man conducting an inventory. "You look different." "I am different, that's so." Dunbar tilted his head slightly. "Calvin's been asking about you." Elias went still. "He kept his face exactly where it was, is he said. "Has some business he says got left unfinished." Dunbar's smile stayed put. "You know how Calvin feels about unfinished business." "Tell Calvin," Elias said, "that whatever business he thinks we have is finished." "Has been for 6 years." Dunbar shrugged. "I'll pass it along." "But you know Calvin." "I know Calvin," Elias said. "That's why I'm telling you what I'm telling you." He put his foot in the stirrup and mounted. Dunbar stepped back, not scared, just calculating. "Nice to know you're still out here," Dunbar said pleasantly. "Makes things easier." Elias rode without looking back. He held himself very still the whole 7 miles home, and his mind was moving the way it moved in the old days, tracking exits, calculating distances, running through every variable of a situation that hadn't arrived yet but was coming. He recognized the feeling. He hated the feeling. He'd spent 6 years trying to be someone that feeling didn't belong to anymore. When he got back to the ranch, Clara was on the porch. She looked at his face, and the smile she'd been forming stopped partway through. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Go inside." She stood up. Elias, Clara. His voice came out harder than he meant it. Please go inside. She looked at him for a moment, not frightened, not retreating, just reading him the way she'd learned to read him in the short time she'd been here. And then she went inside without another word. He stood by the horse and breathed. Then he went and put the horse away and came back and sat on the front step in the dark for a long time, working through it. Calvin Mercer. Of all the things he'd walked away from, the violence, the reputation, the life that had nearly consumed him, Calvin Mercer was the one piece he hadn't been able to fully leave behind. Not because he owed the man anything, not really. The debt, Calvin claimed, was a fabrication built on a misremembering of old events, or possibly a deliberate lie. But Calvin was the kind of man who made his fictions real through sheer persistence. And now Calvin knew where he was, and Clara was here. That was the part that sat in his chest like a stone. The door opened behind him. She came and sat beside him on the step, not close, but beside. She had 2 cups of coffee, handed him one. He took it. They sat. You don't have to tell me, she said, I know. But I want you to know that I've been in situations before where keeping me uninformed made things worse, she said. Not because I'd panic, because I'd have been more useful if I'd known. He looked at his coffee. There's a man, he said. Named Calvin Mercer. We have history. What kind of history? The kind that follows you, he said. I rode with his outfit a long time ago. Before Margaret, before any of this, he paused. I wasn't a good man then. I want to be honest about that. I did things for money and reputation that I'm not proud of. Calvin ran that world. He was smart and ruthless, and he had a talent for making people feel like they owed him things they didn't owe him. And he's found you, she said. He's found out where I am, Elias said. That's a first step for a man like him. She was quiet for a moment. Is he dangerous? Yes. She absorbed that. What does he want? He claims there's a debt, old money from a job that went wrong years ago. I've told myself and him, the one time we had words about it, that it doesn't exist. But Calvin doesn't lose interest in things he's decided to pursue. He's coming here, she said. Not unquestionably. She turned and looked at him. Because of the ranch? He looked at her. Then he looked away. Because of the ranch, he said. And other things, she understood. He saw it register in her face, not fear, exactly. Something more complicated. The understanding of what it meant that she was here. That her presence was a variable in someone else's dangerous calculation. I should go, she said. No, he said immediately. She blinked. He hadn't planned to say it that fast. But it was out. You're not going anywhere because of Calvin Mercer, he said. That's not how this works, Elias, if I'm a liability. You're not a liability, he said. You're someone who lives here. That's different. She looked at him steadily. Do you understand what you're saying? I understand exactly what I'm saying, he said, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't argue with me about it tonight. She was quiet. Okay, she said finally. Okay, they drank their coffee. I can shoot, she said after a while. He turned and looked at her. Not well, she admitted, but I'm not helpless. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, something slightly more complicated than that. Something that lived alongside worry and unexpected warmth. Good to know, he said. She went to bed. He stayed on the step until well past midnight, watching the dark edge of the road that came up from the south. And he made himself think very clearly about who he was and who he'd been, and what the difference actually meant when a man with a grudge and no conscience came knocking. The next morning he went out to the shed and checked his rifle. Clara watched him do it from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. He appreciated that. He appreciated it so much it scared him a little. The following week passed with an outward calm that both of them maintained by quiet agreement. Elias worked the ranch. Clara cooked, gardened, mended, and continued to fix things she found broken in small ways that accumulated into something that looked, if you weren't careful about looking, like a home being tended. She found a loose board under the kitchen window and wedged it. She rehung the back door so it stopped scraping. She mended the curtain in the front room that had been hanging by a single hook for what appeared to be years. One evening Elias came in and saw the curtain hung properly and stopped in the doorway. You fixed that, he said. It was bothering me, she said. I hope that's all right. It's all right, he said. But he stood there for another moment, Elias. It was Margaret's curtain, he said. She hung it herself. Clara went very still. I didn't know. I'm sorry, I can take it down, I can put it back. No, he said. She hung it because she wanted it to work, he said. It was supposed to hang right. She would have fixed it herself the moment she noticed it sagging. He paused. She would have said it took me long enough. Clara watched him. He moved to his chair, sat down. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she said softly. That night he lay in the bed that still sometimes smelled faintly of Margaret, and he stared at the ceiling, and he made himself take inventory of what was happening to him. He was thinking about Clara during the day. Not in the way a man thinks about a beautiful woman, though. Clara was that, in a direct and unadorned way that had nothing to do with artifice. He was thinking about her the way he thought about things that mattered. The way he thought about fence lines that needed attention and cattle that were off their feed and weather that needed watching. She had become part of his awareness, not an intrusion. A presence. And the difference between those two things was significant enough that it kept him awake for an hour past where sleep normally took him. He was 51 years old. He had loved one woman and she had died, and the idea of anything like that again had always felt not just impossible, but somehow disrespectful to what he'd had. But Clara was here, and she had fixed Margaret's curtain. And somehow that was the thing his mind kept returning to, not as something painful, but as something that felt, for reasons he couldn't explain fully, like grace. He closed his eyes. He didn't have answers. He didn't need answers tonight. But he stopped telling himself that the walls were entirely necessary. Just for tonight, just a little, he let himself rest. The trouble arrived before Calvin did. It came in the form of a woman named Helen Greer, wife of the rancher, who'd been so loudly curious in the general store, who appeared at the ranch gate on a Tuesday afternoon with two other women from town and the expressed intention of checking in on the situation. Elias wasn't there. He'd ridden out to the north pasture after lunch. Clara was alone. She opened the gate herself, because that was what you did when visitors came, and she stood on the porch and watched the three women come up the yard with the bright, sharp energy of people performing concern while delivering judgment. Miss Bennet, said Helen Greer. She was a woman who carried her own authority like a garment she'd chosen deliberately. We wanted to be neighborly. That's kind of you, Clara said evenly. We've heard about your situation, said one of the other women, younger, with the restless eyes of someone who finds most things more interesting as gossip than as reality. Arriving as you did. Alone with nothing, I arrived in response to an employment posting, Clara said. Is that the situation you mean? A beat. The three women exchanged something. We mean, said Helen, choosing her words with the particular care of a woman who has decided she isn't being unkind, only honest, that a young woman living alone with a man of Mr. Whitaker's reputation is in a delicate position. My position is employed, Clara said. Yes, but Mrs. Greer, Clara said, I've cooked 3 meals a day, repaired 5 broken things, and started a kitchen garden from dead soil. If that's the delicate position you're concerned about, I appreciate the worry, but I believe I have it managed. Silence. The younger woman with the restless eyes pressed her lips together like she was trying not to smile. You don't know this man's history, Helen said. Her voice dropped its brightness slightly. Underneath it was something that might have been genuine. He was a gunslinger, Miss Bennet, a hired gun. There are stories. There are always stories, Clara said. I've found that stories about a man and the actual man rarely share more than a name. You're very confident for someone who's known him less than 2 weeks, Helen said. I'm not confident, Clara said. I'm observant. There's a difference. She held the woman's gaze. Mr. Whitaker hasn't raised his voice once. He's been fair. He's taught me things he didn't have to teach me, and he corrected a man in town who spoke about me disrespectfully, which he didn't have to do either. She paused. I've lived with people who were supposed to be respectable. I've worked for families who attended church every Sunday. And some of those people treated me considerably worse than the former gunslinger has in 12 days. She paused again. So I think I can assess my own situation. But thank you for the visit. The younger woman was definitely suppressing a smile now. Helen Greer looked at Clara for a long moment. Something moved in her face, not capitulation exactly, but recalibration. The look of a woman encountering an argument she hadn't anticipated. You're stronger than I expected, she said. Most people are, Clara said. They left. Clara went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, just breathing. Her hands were steady, she hadn't shaken once, but she was aware now, in a new way, of the position she was in, not afraid of it, but aware. The town was watching, the town had opinions, and those opinions had the potential to make life significantly more complicated. She started making bread. Kneading dough was good for thinking. By the time Elias came home, she had 3 loaves ready. The kitchen smelled extraordinary, and she had decided something. You had visitors, he said when he came in. He'd seen the wheel tracks in the yard. Helen Greer and 2 others, she said. She handed him coffee. What did they want? To warn me about you, she said. And to see whether I was someone who could be warned. He looked at her. And what did they decide, Mrs.? Greer called me stronger than she expected. A pause. I think she meant it as a compliment. He snorted a small sound, almost involuntary. It might have been a laugh. What did you tell them, he said. The truth, she said. That you've been fair and decent, and that stories about men are frequently more dramatic than the men themselves. He went quiet, set his cup down, looked at her. Clara, he said. You don't have to defend me. I know I don't have to, she said. That's rather the point, isn't it? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked his cup back up and said, Those loaves are going to be good. They're always good, she said, and that was that. Except it wasn't, because that evening he came in from checking the south fence and found her sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, writing something. She covered it when she heard him, a quick instinctive gesture, and then stopped herself and uncovered it again, because the covering was the thing that needed explaining. I was writing a letter, she said before he could ask. To who? She looked at the paper. My sister, half-sister, technically. She's in St. Louis. We haven't spoken in 3 years. He hung up his hat. Why not? Because when things fell apart I left fast and I didn't leave well, she said. I was ashamed of needing help and not having any, and being the kind of person who seemed to keep landing in bad situations. I didn't want her to see that. She looked at the paper. I've started this letter about 16 times. What stops you? Not knowing how to explain where I am, she said. Geographically or otherwise, she paused. But I think I know now. Geographically, anyway. Something quiet passed between them. Write the letter, he said. I'll write it to the post Thursday. She looked up. You don't have Thursday, he said. I'm going anyway. She looked back down at the paper. Okay, she said. He moved past her to the fire, and she picked up the pencil. 2 days later, the letter was done and folded and addressed. She put it on the table before breakfast, and he put it in his breast pocket without a word, which was the most delicate thing she'd seen him do. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride down the road and turn east toward Ridgecross, and she thought about what it meant, this man, carrying her letter to her sister in his front pocket. 7 miles each way on a Thursday, just because he said he would. She thought about Helen Greer's face. She thought about what the town believed it knew. She thought about the empty chair and the locket she'd glimpsed once in his hand, late at night when she'd gotten up for water, and he hadn't heard her. She turned back to the kitchen and found herself smiling at the bowl of bread dough she'd left rising on the counter. Not a performed smile, not a real one. Small and private and startling. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and stood there for a moment, feeling the shape of something she hadn't felt in a long time, something she hadn't trusted enough to name in years, and she let herself feel it, just for a moment, before she went back to work. Elias came home from Ridgecross later than expected. He unsaddled the horse and came in through the back. And she knew immediately that something had happened. Not because he looked different, because he looked exactly the same, which was how he looked when he was working to keep himself from looking different. She set his plate on the table and sat down across from him. He ate 3 bites. They were there, he said. Who? Dunbar and the man with him, he said, at the saloon. Different table, same eyes, watching me the whole time I was in the store. He set his fork down. They're not just passing through. Clara said nothing. But she put her hands flat on the table, a small unconscious gesture of steadying herself. They're waiting, she said. They're waiting, he confirmed. For what? For Calvin to tell them what comes next, he said. They're scouts, that's how he operates. He sends people first to confirm what he's found. Then he comes himself. He looked at his plate. He's coming here, Clara. It might be a week, might be 2, but he's coming. She absorbed this. What do you want to do? She said. He looked up. Something in his face shifted as if the question itself surprised him. As if he hadn't expected her to ask what he wanted. I want to deal with it, without becoming who I used to be, he said. That's all I know for certain. That's enough to start with, she said. He looked at her across the table. Are you afraid? He said. She met his eyes. Yes, she said. I'm also staying. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork. And the evening moved on around them, the fire, the dishes, the quiet ordinary sounds of 2 people occupying the same space, while underneath all of it, something was building. Something that had the shape of a storm and the weight of 6 years of silence and the particular tension of 2 wounded people who had stopped pretending, just barely, that none of this mattered. It mattered. They both knew it mattered, and neither of them said so. Because some things, when you're still learning to believe in them, are too fragile to name before they're strong enough to hold the weight of the words. The letter came back, not returned, answered. 10 days after Elias had ridden it to Ridgecross, a reply arrived at the general store, addressed to Clara Bennett, care of the Whitaker Ranch. Franklin held it behind the counter and handed it to Elias on a Thursday without comment, which was the most diplomatic thing the man had ever done. Elias rode home with it in his breast pocket, next to where he sometimes carried the locket. He handed it to Clara without ceremony. She took one look at the handwriting on the front and went completely still. It came, she said. It came, he said. She held it in both hands for a moment without opening it. Like she was weighing it, like she needed to be sure she was ready for whatever was inside before she broke the seal. He turned and went outside to give her the room. He was at the water pump when he heard a single sharp exhale from inside the cabin. Not a cry, not loud, but the kind of sound a person makes when something they've been bracing against for years suddenly releases. He kept pumping water. When she came out 20 minutes later, her eyes were red but her face was composed. She sat on the step. She's not angry, Clara said. That's good. She thought I was dead. Clara's voice was flat with the effort of not letting it shake. 3 years. She thought something had happened to me. She pressed her lips together. She has a daughter now. She named her Clara. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. That's he started. I know, she said. They were quiet. She wants me to come to St. Louis, Clara said. She says there's room. She says she stopped, cleared her throat. She says to come home. He said nothing. She looked at him. I'm not going, she said. In case you were about to be reasonable about it. Something moved in his jaw. I'm not going, she said again. Firmly. I'm going to write her back and tell her I'm well, and I'm settled, and I'll come visit when the season allows. But I'm not going to St. Louis, she held his gaze. I'm staying here. He looked at her for a long time. You're certain, he said. I've been certain for 2 weeks, she said. I just hadn't said it yet. He turned back to the pump. But his hands had stopped moving. Elias, she said. Yeah, say something. He turned around, looked at her directly, the way he didn't always let himself look at her. I'm glad, he said. That's all, I'm glad. She held his gaze for just a moment. Then she went inside to write the reply. And Elias stood at the pump with his hands hanging at his sides and understood, with the clarity of a man who has stopped lying to himself, that the thing he'd been refusing to name for 3 weeks had just been named whether he liked it or not. He liked it. That was the terrifying part. He liked it considerably. Calvin Mercer arrived on a Wednesday. There was no warning. No horses spotted on the ridge, no sound of wheels on the road. One moment the morning was ordinary Clara in the garden, Elias repairing a harness in the barn, and the next moment there were 3 men on horseback coming up the road from the south gate. And the way they moved said everything about why they were there. Elias heard the horses and came out of the barn. He knew Calvin immediately, even after 6 years. Some men age in ways that change them. Calvin Mercer aged in ways that concentrated him, made him thinner, harder, more distilled. He rode like a man who expected the ground to behave itself. He stopped 20 feet from the barn. "Elias Whitaker," he said. His voice was the same, easy, conversational, with the particular warmth of someone who has learned that warmth is the most disarming weapon available. "Calvin," Elias said. He hadn't reached for the revolver. Not yet. He kept his hands loose. Calvin looked around the yard with the assessing sweep of someone taking inventory. His eyes landed on Clara, who had straightened up from the garden and was watching with the stillness of a person who has learned that stillness is its own kind of armor. "Nice place," Calvin said. His eyes came back to Elias. "Didn't know you had it in you to build something." "What do you want?" Calvin came to talk. Calvin swung down from the horse. His 2 men stayed mounted. Dunbar was one of them, pale eyes, patient. The other was the younger man Elias had seen in Ridgecross. "Figured we were overdue. We talked 6 years ago," Elias said. "We said everything there was to say." "You said everything," Calvin said pleasantly. "I had more to add and didn't get the chance." He took a few steps forward, slow, hands visible, not from deference but from the performance of it. "You left with money that wasn't entirely yours to leave with." "The money from the Laramie job was split 4 ways," Elias said. "I took my quarter. That's what we agreed. The agreement changed after you left." "Agreements don't change after someone leaves," Elias said. "That's not how agreements work." Calvin smiled. It was the kind of smile that had convinced a lot of people of a lot of things over the years. "See, that's what I always liked about you, Elias. You always had that sense of principle." He glanced toward Clara again. "Things have changed for you. The woman is my cook," Elias said. "She has nothing to do with this." "I can see she's important to you," Calvin said. "A man who doesn't care about something doesn't build a sign saying it's home." Elias went very still. Clara had come around the edge of the garden fence. She was 20 feet to his left. He didn't look at her because he didn't want Calvin tracking his eyes. "Name a number," Elias said. 500, Calvin said. "Gold? I don't have 500 in gold. Then we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" Elias said. Calvin tilted his head slightly. "The kind that makes living somewhere very difficult." He looked around the yard again. "Nice fence, good barn. Shame if things started going wrong." "Are you threatening my property, Calvin?" "I'm describing a possibility," Calvin said. "I find possibilities are more persuasive than threats." He smiled again. "Give me 2 weeks. Get me the money. We part as friends." "We were never friends," Elias said. "No," Calvin agreed. "But we can be civilized." He turned, mounted his horse with the unhurried ease of a man who believes the conversation ended the way he intended, and the 3 of them rode back down the road. Elias stood exactly where he was until the sound of horses faded. Then Clara was beside him. $500, she said. "Yes. Do you have it not in gold?" He turned and looked at the road. "I have cattle I could sell. It would take time. Are you going to pay him?" He was quiet. "If I pay him once," he said, "he comes back." That's how Calvin operates. The first payment is always the beginning, not the end. He turned to look at her. "He'll take whatever I give him and come back for more." "Then what do you do, I think," he said, carefully. She looked at him. "How much time do you think you have?" 2 weeks, he said, possibly less. He started moving toward the house. "Clara, I need you to listen to me. I'm listening. If something happens, nothing is going to happen. If something happens," he said again firmly, "I need you to ride to Ridgecross. Not walk. Ride, take the brown mare, she's fast. Go to Franklin at the general store and tell him to send for the county sheriff." "Can you do that?" "Yes," she said, "but I'm not going to need to." Probably not, he said, but I need to know you know. She held his gaze. I know, she said, now tell me what else. He looked at her. And something in him shifted the way a man looks when he's realized that the person beside him isn't waiting to be protected, but is actively choosing to stand there. Come inside, he said. I need to think out loud and you're going to have to listen. She followed him in without a word. They sat at the table. He talked. She listened, not passively, but the way she listened to everything, with her full attention and the occasional sharp question that pulled the thinking into better shape. Calvin has 2 men with him, he said. Dunbar, I know he's experienced but cautious. He won't move without direction. The young one I don't know, which makes him unpredictable. Could there be more? She said. There could. He drummed his fingers once on the table, then stopped. He won't do anything obvious. That's not Calvin. He prefers pressure to confrontation. He wants me to come to him, not the other way around. But if you don't come to him, eventually he escalates, Elias said. Something happens to the cattle. The fence goes down. Something burns. He looked at the table. He needs it to look like bad luck. Not like him, unless, Clara said slowly. He looked at her. Unless he has a reason to do something obvious, she said. Something that gives him cover. What kind of cover? He called the money a debt, she said. If he could make other people believe it's a legitimate debt, make the town believe you wronged him, then anything he does looks like justice instead of extortion. Elias stared at her. He's going to go to Ridgecross, she said. He's going to tell a story. Elias pushed back from the table and stood. Franklin, he said. You need to get there first, she said. Tell Franklin yourself, before Calvin's version becomes the only version. He looked at her for a full second. When did you get so sharp about men like Calvin, he said. She held his gaze. I've met men like Calvin before, she said quietly. Just in smaller versions. He held that, nodded once. I'll ride tomorrow morning, he said. Tonight, she said. Clara, tonight, she said again. He was already one step ahead by knowing where you were. Don't give him another. He was already reaching for his hat. He rode to Ridgecross in the last light of the afternoon and arrived as Franklin was closing the store. He talked for 15 minutes. Franklin was a careful listener. He asked 2 questions and said very little else, but what he said was enough. I'll remember what you've told me, Franklin said. That's all I need, Elias said. He rode home. Clara had supper waiting. She looked up when he came through the door and he said done, and she nodded and handed him a plate, and that was enough. They ate. They didn't speak much, but it wasn't the silence of distance. It was the silence of 2 people who have just done a hard thing together and don't need to narrate it. When the plates were cleared, she poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table, and they sat without moving for a few minutes in the easy quiet of the fire. Thank you, he said. For what? For being 3 steps ahead of me this afternoon. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I wasn't ahead of you. You'd have gotten there, he said, but not as fast. She looked at him sideways, Elias Whitaker admitting someone else had a useful thought. I want to mark the date. The corner of his mouth moved. That ghost of a smile, it came easier now than it had 3 weeks ago. Don't push it, he said. She smiled at her coffee. The next 3 days were quiet, too quiet, the way a sky goes quiet before it decides what kind of storm it's going to be. On the 2nd day, Dunbar rode past the gate slowly, didn't stop, didn't turn in, just rode past at a pace that made it clear the pass was deliberate. Elias was at the fence and watched him go. Dunbar looked straight ahead, which was its own kind of message. On the 3rd day, the Hendersons, a farming family 2 miles north, rode past and stopped to say that someone had been asking about the Whitaker ranch in town. Asking how long Elias had been there, whether he had money. Whether the woman living with him was his wife. Elias thanked them and went inside. He's building something, he told Clara. A story, she said. A story, he agreed. Then we need to be seen, she said. Together in town before his story has a shape. He looked at her. If people see us normal, ordinary, not hiding, it's harder for the story to take hold, she said. A man who owes a dangerous debt doesn't take his cook to town to buy flour. You want to go to Ridgecross, he said. I want to go to Ridgecross, she said. And I want you to tip your hat at people. And I want to buy flour, and I want anyone who's heard a whisper of Calvin Mercer's version of things to see exactly what we are." "And what are we?" he said. She held his gaze without blinking. "Ordinary people living an ordinary life. That's the most powerful thing we can be right now." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've done this before," he said. "Navigated something like this." "Not exactly like this," she said. "But I've learned that the best defense against a story is a better one." He picked up his hat. "We go Saturday," he said. She went back to the stove. But he stood in the doorway for just a second longer than necessary, watching her move through his kitchen with the particular ease of someone who has stopped treating a space like borrowed territory, and he thought about the word she'd used. She'd said it without hesitating. "What are we?" He turned and went outside before his face could say something he wasn't ready to say out loud. Saturday arrived. They rode the 7 miles to Ridgecross side by side on horseback, Clara on the brown mare and Elias on his gray, and the morning was clear and fast, and she rode with the ease of someone who'd ridden since childhood. Which he filed away as another thing about her he hadn't known. The town noticed them. That was the whole point, and it worked the way she said it would. People didn't know what to do with Normal. A man with a dangerous reputation buying salt pork and flour with his cook walking beside him, carrying a basket, pointing at a bolt of cotton fabric in the dry goods section, with the focused attention of a woman deciding whether she can justify the cost. It was aggressively, stubbornly ordinary, and the eyes that followed them through Ridgecross were the eyes of people recalibrating. Until they came out of the general store. Calvin Mercer was across the street. He was standing in front of the saloon with 4 men, this time not 3. 2 Elias recognized, 2 he didn't, and Calvin was watching them with the expression of a man who has just seen his plans require adjustment. Clara saw him. Elias felt her go still beside him, not afraid but alert. The same stillness she'd used that first morning when he'd told her to stop at the yard's edge. "Don't look away," she said quietly, not to him, to herself. "I know," he said, equally quiet. He looked at Calvin across the street. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't change his pace. He just held the man's gaze with the steady, cold clarity of someone who has decided exactly where the line is. Calvin smiled. He touched the brim of his hat. Elias said nothing. He took the basket from Clara, placed it on the horse, helped her mount with a hand that was steady, even though every instinct he had was vibrating, and then he mounted himself and they rode down the main street at an unhurried pace. He felt the eyes behind them. He did not look back. Clara was quiet for a mile, then she said, "He wanted you to draw." "I know. Right there in the street," she said, "with everyone watching." That's what he wanted. Yes, he wanted everyone to see the old Elias Whitaker, she said. Because if you drew first, you become the dangerous one. His story writes itself. "You understand how men like Calvin think," Elias said. "I understand how men think when they want to make someone else look like the problem," she said flatly. He looked at her sideways as they rode. She was staring at the road ahead, jaw set, and he saw something in her face that he hadn't seen before, not fear, not even anger exactly. Something older and more settled than anger. The look of someone who has been maneuvered before and has learned to read the board. "What did they do to you?" he said. "The family, when they put you out." She was quiet for a long time. "The brother told everyone in town that I'd stolen from them," she said. Before I could say anything, before I could even get my bag packed, she kept her eyes on the road. "By the time I walked out the front gate, there wasn't a person in that town who'd look at me." A pause. I tried to defend myself. Nobody wanted to hear it. Because his version had been first, and it was more interesting than mine. Elias absorbed this. "That's why you knew," he said. "That's why I knew," she said. "A man like Calvin is just a larger version of the same thing." She finally looked at him. "He's trying to make sure no one believes your version. The only answer is to be visible and consistent, and to never give anyone a reason to doubt you." He looked at the road. "You didn't steal from them," he said. "Did you?" "No," she said simply. "I didn't steal anything in my life." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You know? I've watched you in my house for 3 weeks," he said. You know exactly what's yours and what isn't. You don't even take an extra spoonful of sugar without asking. He kept his eyes forward. I know. She turned back to the road. Something had shifted, in her breathing quiet, almost invisible. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me for believing the obvious thing, he said. She almost smiled. They rode in silence for another mile. Then she said, he's going to come to the ranch. Yes. Not just to talk this time. No, he said, not just to talk. When soon, he said. He saw us today. He saw that I'm not paying and I'm not hiding and I'm not going to become what he needs me to become. He shifted in the saddle. Men like Calvin have a limit to their patience when the performance stops going their way. What happens when he comes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I handle it, he said. We handle it, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. Clara, he said, and there was something in his voice, a weight, a careful, deliberate weight. I need you to understand something. Tell me. What I'm going to do when Calvin comes, he said, is not going to be what he expects. I'm not going to be the man he remembers. I'm not going to draw first. I'm not going to lose my head. He paused. But things may happen that are frightening. Things may escalate, and I need you to trust that I have a plan, even if in the moment it doesn't look like one. She held his gaze. Do you have a plan, she said. He was quiet for just long enough. I'm working on one, he said. She laughed. It came out sudden and genuine, and startled both of them. She pressed her lips together. But it had already happened. A real laugh, out loud, on a dusty road in Montana, with trouble 2 miles behind them and more coming. He stared at her. I'm sorry, she said, still fighting it. I'm sorry. It's not, it isn't funny. It's a little funny, he said. Something in his chest had cracked open slightly, like a door someone pushed just an inch. You're working on a plan, she repeated, composing herself. I have the outline of a plan, he said. That's genuinely comforting, she said gravely. You're being sarcastic. Completely, she said. He looked at the road. His mouth was doing the thing it had been doing more often lately, that fractional movement that wasn't quite a smile and was definitely more than nothing. The plan, he said, involves the sheriff. She looked at him. County sheriff, he said, not Ridgecross the county. His name is Aldous Webb. I've met him twice. He's methodical and he dislikes men like Calvin for reasons that are personal and professional both. He kept his eyes on the road. If Calvin makes a move against the property, if he does anything visible and documentable, Webb can act. But I have to give him something to act on, she understood. So you need Calvin to do something. I need Calvin to do something, he said. Which he will, because Calvin cannot help himself when he's being ignored. She thought about it. So the plan, she said slowly, is to keep doing exactly what we're doing. Living normally, being visible, not reacting, until he does something stupid. That's the plan, he said. That's actually a good plan, she said. Thank you. Much better than I expected from someone who described it as an outline. Clara, yes? Stopping, she said. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was the best kind, the kind that's full rather than empty, that sits between two people like something warm and mutual and carefully tended. When they got back, she made supper and he wrote a letter. Not to Calvin, not to anyone connected to this situation. To Aldous Webb, County Sheriff, care of the courthouse in Helena. He described the situation plainly and completely, the history, with Calvin Mercer, the men who'd arrived, the implied threats to property, the conversation in the yard. He named dates, he named the amount Calvin had cited. He described the street encounter in Ridgecross. He signed it with his full name and his exact location, and he sealed it. Clara brought coffee and looked at the envelope. Webb, she said. Webb, he confirmed. She set the coffee down. You're leaving a record, she said. I'm leaving a record, he said. Whatever happens, whatever Calvin does, whatever I do in response, there's a record that says what actually happened and in what order. So no one can build a different story, she said. So no one can build a different story, he said. She looked at him across the table. That, she said quietly, is what I should have done. 3 years ago, he met her eyes. You know now, he said. She nodded slowly. Something passed across her face, not regret exactly. More like the look of someone who has just understood that the thing that hurt them most could also be the thing that made them better equipped for what comes next. "I'll ride this to Ridgecross tomorrow," he said. "First post." "I'll come with you," she said. He looked at her. "Visibility," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee. "Visibility," he agreed. That night, long after Clara had gone to bed, Elias sat in his chair and held the locket in his hand, and he talked to Margaret. He didn't do it out loud. He never did it out loud. But he did it in the space behind his sternum, where she still lived, the way she'd always lived even after she was gone, present, clear, a voice that sounded like sense when everything else was noise. "I didn't expect this," he told her. He could almost hear her, the laugh first, always the laugh. "I know you didn't. That's usually how the good things arrive." "She's different," he said. "She is," the voice agreed. "So are you now. That's rather the point." He sat with that. "I'm scared," he admitted. "That's the most honest thing you've said in 6 years," she said. "Good." He looked at the locket. "I don't want to lose someone again," he said. "Then stop acting like you already have," she said. He closed his hand around the silver. Outside, the Montana night pressed its silence against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire was low, the house was warm, and somewhere down the back hall, Clara Bennett was asleep in the small room off the back hallway that had been storage for 5 years before she arrived and had become, without anyone deciding it, hers. Elias Whitaker sat in his chair. He did not feel alone. He wasn't sure yet what that meant or what to do with it, or whether the wanting of it was permission enough to reach for it. But he held the locket, and for the first time in 6 years, he didn't hold it like a goodbye. The letter to Aldous Webb went out on a Monday. By Wednesday, Calvin Mercer had burned 3 fence posts on the south line. Elias found them in the early morning, still smoking at the bases, the wire pulled and curled back in a way that let the cattle through into the open grass beyond. He'd spent 2 hours rounding up what had wandered before the sun was properly up, and by the time he came back to the barn, his jaw was set in the particular way Clara had learned meant he was working hard to stay controlled. She handed him coffee without speaking. He took it. Stood in the doorway, drank half of it. "South fence," he said. "I heard the cattle," she said. "How many got out?" 11. Got them all back." He looked at the cup. "He's starting. He's testing," she said, "seeing if you'll react." "I know what he's doing," he said. He set the cup down on the porch rail. "I need to ride the whole fence line today. Check for anything else." "I'll come. Clara, I'll come," she said again. "2 sets of eyes are faster than one, and you need to know the full extent before tonight." He looked at her, then he nodded once. They rode the full perimeter of the property together, moving methodically, and Clara called out what she found, the same way she called out everything plainly, without drama. With the focused attention of someone who understands that the facts matter more than the feeling about them. 2 more posts pulled on the eastern side. A gate latch broken clean off in a way that didn't happen naturally. A section of the water trough diverted, the pipe bent at an angle that would read like accident to someone who didn't know what they were looking at. "He has more men than we thought," Clara said, looking at the bent pipe. "This and the fence, at the same time, that's not 2 people." "No," Elias said, "it's not. He's expanded since Ridgecross." "Or he had more waiting further south and brought them up." He looked at the pipe. "Either way, this isn't Dunbar and one other. This is a crew." They rode back in silence, both of them running numbers, and when they got to the barn they sat on the fence rail in the late morning, and Elias said quietly, "I need Webb to move faster." "Can you send another letter?" "A letter takes too long," he said. "I need someone to ride to Helena." Clara looked at him. Franklin has a business to protect," he said. "I can't ask him to ride to Helena, then who?" He was quiet. She looked at him steadily. "I'll go." "Absolutely not." "Elias, Clara, if you ride out alone right now, with Calvin's men spread across this territory, the answer is no." He said it without room for argument, not as a command, but as a fact. "That is not a thing I'm willing to consider." She looked at him for a moment. The firmness in his voice had a different quality than his usual quiet authority, something more urgent and more raw, and she heard it. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They sat. Henderson, she said. He turned. The Hendersons 2 miles north, she said. They came to tell you about Calvin asking questions. They were trying to help. If you sent word, ask them to ride to Helena on your behalf. He was already standing. You think like a general, he said. I think like someone who's been powerless before and learned to map every resource available, she said. He looked at her for a beat. Then he went inside, wrote a short urgent letter to Webb, wrote a separate note to the Henderson family, and was on his horse inside of 15 minutes. Clara watched him ride north. She went inside and checked the rifle he kept above the back door. It was loaded. She made sure she knew where the extra cartridges were. Then she went back to the kitchen and made bread. Because there was nothing else useful she could do right now, and because the kneading helped her think, and because if Calvin Mercer himself walked up the road today, she was not going to be the kind of woman found standing uselessly in a yard. She was going to be the kind found standing in her own kitchen, with bread in the oven and a clear head. Elias came back inside of an hour. Henderson's eldest son, 17 solid, with a horse that could make Helena in a day, had taken the letter without hesitation and ridden south before Elias had finished explaining. Henderson himself had walked Elias back to his horse and said quietly that if Elias needed men on his fence line tonight, he had 3 he could spare. Elias had thanked him and meant it. He came inside and told Clara, and she set a plate in front of him and sat down across from him and said, how long before Webb could realistically arrive? 3 days if the boy makes good time and Webb moves immediately, he said. 4 more likely, and Calvin moves again before that. Almost certainly, he said. He's not patient when he's not being met. The fence was a message. The next thing will be louder. She watched him eat. Then she said, you're going to have to confront him before Webb gets here. He looked up. Not with a gun, she said quickly. But you're going to have to meet him. Face to face, without drawing, without losing your temper. And you're going to have to do it in a way that buys enough time for the law to arrive, and makes him look like exactly what he is. He was quiet. That's the only way this ends clean, she said. If Webb rides up and Calvin's already gone, the problem just relocates. But if Webb rides up and Calvin is here, in the middle of something provable. He arrests him, Elias said. He arrests him, she said. And it's over. Elias set his fork down. You're asking me to bait him. I'm asking you to let him bait himself, she said. Which is different. Men like Calvin bait themselves the moment they believe they're winning. He looked at her across the table. You're something, Clara Bennett, he said. It came out quiet and direct, and with more underneath it than either of them addressed. She looked at her hands. I just think clearly when I'm frightened, she said. It's the only useful thing fear ever did for me. He picked up his fork again. Tonight, he said, Henderson's men are on the south fence. I'll take the north and west. I'll stay inside, she said. With the rifle, you know how to use it. You showed me last week, she said. That was one lesson. It was a good lesson, she said. I pay attention. He looked at her. Don't use it unless someone comes through the door, he said. Not the yard, not the gate, the door, understood, she said. Clara, Elias, I understand, she said. I'm not going to shoot Dunbar because he looks at the porch. Something in his expression shifted, the ghost of that almost smile. Good, he said. They got through the night. Nothing happened, which was its own kind of message. Calvin was watching, waiting, letting the tension build. Elias came in at dawn and Clara had coffee waiting, and they sat together in the early light and neither of them spoke much. But the silence had the texture of 2 people who have spent a night on opposite sides of the same danger and come through it together and know it. On the second day after the fence burning, Calvin came back. Not with 3 men this time, with 5. They came up the road in the early afternoon, not raffle fast, not riding slow. I ride men who believe the math is in their favor. Elias saw them from the barn and walked out to the yard and stood. Clara appeared in the cabin doorway. He turned and looked at her once. She held his gaze. Then she stepped back inside, not away from it, but into position the way they'd discussed. He turned back to the road. Calvin stopped his horse at the edge of the yard. Elias, he said, pleasant as ever. I hear you've been repairing fences. I repair what gets broken, Elias said, good man. Calvin looked around the yard. His eyes moved to the cabin, to the doorway where Clara had been. I also hear you've been sending letters to Helena. Elias said nothing, but something tightened in his chest, not fear, calculation. Calvin had eyes in Ridgecross, probably Franklin's store boy or someone at the post. That concerns me, Calvin said. It suggests you're not interested in resolving this privately. There's nothing to resolve, Elias said. You burned my fence posts and bent my water pipe. That's destruction of property, Calvin. That's not a debt negotiation. Calvin tilted his head slightly. Those posts burned? That's terrible. Could have been anyone. Could have been, Elias said. Wasn't. Calvin's pleasant expression didn't change. I came to give you one more opportunity, he said. I'm a reasonable man. 400 now. Call it settled. I said no 2 weeks ago, Elias said. I'll say no today. I'll say no every day after. Calvin looked at him for a long moment. The pleasantness didn't leave his face, but underneath it, something colder moved. You've changed, Calvin said. You used to be smarter than this. I used to be a lot of things, Elias said. I'm not those things anymore. No, Calvin said. He glanced at the cabin again. You're a man with something to protect now. He said it the way you say a threat without quite saying it. That changes the calculations, does it? Elias said. A man with nothing to protect, Calvin said, is hard to move. But a man who cares about what he's built, he left it there in the air. Elias felt it land. He also felt with the cold precision of someone who has navigated worse than Calvin Mercer and survived it that this was exactly the moment Clara had described. Calvin believing he was winning, Calvin leaning in. Calvin making himself the obvious problem in front of witnesses. Because Henderson's 3 men were on the south side of the property. And they were watching, and Elias had made sure they understood what to watch for. Calvin, he said, you just threatened my home and the person who lives in it. In front of 4 witnesses, on property you've already admitted twice, right here in this yard, to targeting. Calvin blinked just once, the pleasantness thinned slightly. I didn't threaten anything, he said. I was having a conversation. You were having a conversation, Elias agreed. So were my neighbors. He didn't move his eyes from Calvin. They've been here the whole time, a pause. Calvin turned slowly and looked at the south fence line. Henderson's men were there, 3 of them on horseback watching. The pleasant expression left Calvin's face entirely. What replaced it was not anger exactly. It was the expression of a man who has just realized the room he thought he was controlling has different walls than he thought. You set this up, Calvin said. I let you set it up, Elias said. There's a difference. You're good at that distinction. I learned it from you. Calvin's jaw was tight. His men behind him were watching him, waiting, because Calvin was the kind of man his men took all their signals from, and right now Calvin wasn't giving signals. He was receiving them. This isn't over, Calvin said. It will be, Elias said. County sheriff is 3 days out. When he arrives, he'll have testimony from me, from my neighbors, and from the postmaster in Ridgecross, who can confirm the timing of your arrival relative to property damage on my land. He held Calvin's gaze. You could be gone by then. That would be the smart move. Calvin looked at him. You're not the man I knew, he said. No, Elias said, I'm not. Calvin held the stare for 5 full seconds. Then he turned his horse. He didn't speak to his men. He just turned and rode, and they followed because that was what they did. And Elias stood in his yard and watched them go, and did not move until the sound of hooves had faded completely. Then his legs felt it, the sustained tension of the last 10 minutes releasing all at once, the way a rope feels when you finally set down a heavy weight. He breathed. Clara was at his side. He hadn't heard her come out. She stood beside him, looking at the road. He'll be back, she said. Maybe, he said, or maybe not. Calvin is a calculator. If the numbers stop working, he finds different numbers. And the numbers stopped working? We just made it very expensive for him to stay, Elias said. He doesn't do expensive. He does easy. She was quiet. You were magnificent, she said. He turned and looked at her. She was still looking at the road, her arms crossed loosely, and there was something in her profile, something in the set of her jaw, and the brightness in her eyes that she was working not to show that hit him squarely in the chest. "I was ready to fall apart," he said honestly. She turned then. Looked at him. "I know," she said, "you didn't. That's what magnificent means." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside." "I need to sit down," she almost laughed. It almost broke through. She pressed her lips together and said, "Yes, absolutely." "Let's go sit down." They went inside. He sat at the table. She put coffee on the stove, and for the next 10 minutes they just existed in the same room without any of it being dramatic, which was the most dramatic relief either of them had felt all week. Webb arrived on the 4th day, not the 3rd, the 4th, because the Henderson boy's horse had thrown a shoe 20 miles out of Helena, and he'd lost half a day. But he arrived, and he was everything Elias had said: methodical, serious, with the particular authority of a man who has cleaned up after people like Calvin Mercer before and has stopped being surprised by them. He sat at Elias's table and read the letter and listened to Elias talk for 20 minutes without interrupting. Then he asked 4 precise questions, wrote the answers in a small notebook, and said, "I know Mercer by reputation. He's been moving through this territory for 2 years. This isn't the first complaint. Has anyone else documented?" Elias said. "2 others," Webb said. "Neither as thoroughly as you." He looked at the letter. Sending this before he escalated was smart. That was Clara's idea, Elias said. Webb looked at Clara, who was sitting quietly at the far end of the table. "You have good instincts, miss," he said. "I've had practice," she said. Webb looked back at Elias. "I'm going to ride to Ridgecross and make some inquiries. If Mercer's still in the area, I'll find him. If he's moved on, his pattern means he'll surface somewhere close. Either way, this territory is going to become uncomfortable for him very quickly." "That's all I need," Elias said. Webb put his notebook away. "Dude, you did this right," he said. "Most men in your position would have reached for a gun." "I thought about it," Elias said. "Most men do," Webb said. "The ones who don't act on it are the ones I can actually help." He picked up his hat. "I'll send word when I have something," he wrote out. Clara and Elias stood on the porch and watched him go. After a moment she said, "Is it over?" "The worst of it," he said. "Calvin won't come back now. Webb's presence means the cost is too high. And if he does come back, then Webb handles it," he said. "That's what the law is for." He paused. "I spent too many years handling things myself because I didn't trust anyone else to do it. I'm done with that." She looked at him sideways. "That's a significant thing to say," she said. "It's a significant thing to mean," he said. "I mean it." She nodded slowly. They stood on the porch a little longer. "Elias," she said, "I need to tell you something." Something shifted in his chest. "Tell me." She looked at her hands. Then up at him when Calvin was in the yard. "When he made that comment about you having something to protect," she paused. "I heard it from inside, and I thought I need to tell you that I'm aware of what my being here has cost you. The risk, the visibility, the reason Calvin had a lever to use." He looked at her directly. "Clara, I'm not leaving," she said quickly. "I want to be clear. I'm not offering to leave, but I want you to know that I know. I'm not unaware of what I've added to your life." He was quiet for a moment. "What have you added to my life?" he said. Slow liberate. She opened her mouth. "No," he said. "I mean it as a real question. What have you added?" She closed her mouth, held his gaze. He turned to look at the yard, the garden, with its new growth pushing through, the curtain Margaret had hung visible through the front window, the step she'd repaired, the tin cup of dried flowers on the sill. "Before you came," he said, "I was surviving. That's all I was doing. Getting from one day to the next without the days meaning anything." He stopped. "Let that sit. You walked up that road with nothing, and you fixed things that I'd been looking at broken for years without seeing them. Not just the house." He turned back to her. "You made me see things I'd stopped looking at." She was very still. "The risk you're talking about," he said, "is real. Calvin used you. He would have used anything I cared about. But the alternative, the version of this where you weren't here, I've lived that version. For 6 years." He held her gaze. "I don't want that version anymore. Her throat moved. "Say it plainly," she said. Her voice was barely above quiet. "I need you to say it plainly, Elias. I've had things implied to me my whole life, and I can't." "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not because you're useful. Not because you cook well or think clearly or fix what's broken. Because you're here. Because I want you here." He paused. "Because this is the first time in 6 years that this place has felt like it could still be a home." The silence that followed was the kind that holds something very large very still. Clara looked at him. Her eyes were bright. She pressed her lips together once. Then she said, "That chair." He blinked. "The empty chair," she said. At the end of the table, he waited. "I've been afraid to ask about it," she said. "What it means. Whether my being here is something you actually want, or whether I'm just filling a space you needed filled." He looked at her for a long moment. "The chair is Margaret's," he said. "It always will be. I'm not going to move it, and I'm not going to pretend she didn't exist, and I'm not going to ask you to be her or replace her, because that's not what this is." He paused. "But Clara, there's a whole table. There's more than one chair. And the table has been empty for 6 years. She looked at him. "I know what I'm asking," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to forget who you've been or where you've come from. I'm not asking you to trust something that doesn't deserve trust yet. I'm asking you to—" He stopped, looked for the word. "Stay, that's all, just stay." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "I already told you 3 weeks ago. I'm staying." He let out a breath. She turned back to look at the yard. "Margaret would have liked the curtain fixed," she said softly. "She would have fixed it herself in the first week," he said. "I know," Clara said. "I thought about that when I was doing it." He looked at her profile. Something in his chest had opened, not cracked this time, but opened. Deliberately. Like a door that had been closed for a long time being turned on its hinges by someone who knew the door was worth opening. "I want to show you something," he said. He went inside. She heard him moving, the sound of a drawer, then the smaller sound of something set on the table. She came in. The locket was on the table. She looked at it. Then at him. "I've seen you holding it," she said. "Late at night sometimes. I didn't say anything." "I know you didn't," he said. "You're good at knowing which things to say and which to let sit." He looked at the locket. It was Margaret's. Her mother gave it to her. She wore it every day. "It's beautiful. I want you to know it's here," he said. "Not because I'm showing you it's here and asking you to do anything about it. Just because I've been carrying it in secret for 6 years, and I'm tired of carrying things in secret." He looked up. "You showed me that, the letter to your sister. The way you said what you needed to say directly." He paused. "I'm still learning." She looked at the locket. "Can I pick it up?" she said. Yes. She lifted it carefully, held it in her palm. Looked at the small oval of tarnished silver. "She was real," Clara said. "She matters. That doesn't go away." "No," he said. "It doesn't, and neither does this," she said. She set the locket back down gently. "Whatever this is, whatever it becomes." She met his eyes. "Both things can be true at once." He looked at her. "I know that," he said. "It just took me a while to believe it was allowed." She reached across the table, not for the locket, but past it, and her hand rested on the table between them, not reaching for his hand but near it, and the proximity of it was its own kind of conversation. He looked at her hand. Then he placed his beside it. Not holding, just close enough. They stood like that in the kitchen of the Whitaker Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late Montana summer, with the garden growing outside, and the curtain hung right, and the fire low, and the chair at the end of the table where it would always be, and the space between them warm, with something that didn't have a name yet but was building toward one, carefully, the way good things always build, not in a rush, not without cost, but solidly, on ground that has been tested and held. Outside, a horse moved in the barn. The wind came through the valley and touched the cabin walls and moved on. The tin cup of dried wildflowers sat in the kitchen window, and the light through the glass was the warm amber of late afternoon, and neither of them moved for a long time, because neither of them needed to. They were, for the first time in longer than either, could properly remember exactly where they wanted to be. Webb sent word 6 days later. A single folded note, delivered by the Henderson boy who'd ridden to Helena, passed through Franklin at the general store, and arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning while Clara was in the garden and Elias was replacing the water pipe Calvin's men had bent. He read it standing at the barn door, still holding the wrench. Then he read it again. Clara came around the side of the house and saw his face. "What does it say?" she said. He held it out. She took it. "Read it." Her eyes moved quickly, then slowed at the bottom paragraph, then stopped. "He arrested him," she said. "Outside of Billings," Elias said. "2 days ago. Calvin and Dunbar both. The younger one turned evidence. He set the wrench down on the fence rail." Webb writes there are 3 other complaints from other territories. The Henderson testimony and mine put him in front of a judge before winter. Clara stood holding the letter. She didn't cry, she didn't make a sound. But she stood very still for a moment, and Elias watched something move through her, something like a long-held breath finally released, something like a fist unclenching. Something he recognized because he'd felt it himself the moment he'd read Webb's first line. It was over, not almost over, not probably over, done. "It's done," she said very quietly. "It's done," he confirmed. She handed the letter back, turned toward the garden. Stopped, then she turned back and walked straight to him, and put her arms around him, not hesitant, not careful, just direct and real and human, the way she did everything and held on. He stood there for half a second, the letter still in one hand and the old wrench nearby, and 6 years of practiced solitude suddenly completely irrelevant. Then he put his arms around her. They stood like that in the yard of the Whitaker Ranch with the morning coming full around them, and it was not a dramatic thing, not a thing with words or performance. It was just 2 people who had walked through something difficult together and come out the other side and were standing in the fact of it. He held on, she held on. When she stepped back, her eyes were dry. But her hands stayed on his arms for just a moment longer. "Good," she said. "Yeah," he said. She went back to the garden. He went back to the pipe, and neither of them spoke much for the rest of the morning, because what had just happened between them was too real to require talking about, and too new to survive being talked about too quickly. But at lunch, when she set the plates down and sat across from him, he looked up and said, "Thank you." She looked at him. "For the letter to Franklin," he said. "For the idea about visibility. For standing behind that door with a rifle you'd had one lesson with." He paused. "For staying," she looked at him steadily. "I told you," she said. "I was already staying." "I know," he said. "Thank you anyway." She picked up her fork. "You're welcome," she said. "Eat, the potatoes are better hot," he ate. The garden that had been dead ground 3 months ago was producing by October. Not extravagantly, it was a late start in a hard season, and the soil had been neglected for years. But there were carrots and late squash and a row of turnips that Clara had nursed with a focused attention Elias had come to recognize as her particular expression of stubbornness. She didn't give up on things. She just kept working them until they responded. He'd noticed that about her early on. He'd noticed a lot of things early on that he'd been filing away without fully examining, the way you feel a change in the weather before you have words for what's coming. One afternoon he came in from the north pasture to find her sitting at the table with 2 letters in front of her, not one. One he recognized as the envelope in his sister's handwriting. The other he didn't. "Second letter from your sister," he said. "Yes," she said, "and one from the family in St. Louis she mentioned. A family there who needs a housekeeper." She looked at it. "Good wages. Stable position. She thought it might be right for me." He went to the stove, poured coffee, said nothing. "She doesn't know," Clara said. "What's here? She still thinks I'm hired help in a temporary situation, and she's trying to take care of me the best way she knows." She turned the letter over in her hands. "She loves me. This is what love looks like when it doesn't have all the information." He came and sat down. "What are you going to tell her?" he said. Clara looked at the letter, then at him. "The truth," she said. "But I need to know what the truth is first." He held her gaze. "What do you need to know?" he said. "Where we are," she said. It came out simple and direct, the way she said difficult things. Not what we could be or might be, where we actually are. Because I'm not the kind of person who tells stories to people she loves. And before I write that letter, I need to know what I'm actually saying." He set his cup down. He'd been thinking about this. Not in the abstract, not in the careful, guarded way he'd thought about it in the early weeks, when even acknowledging that he felt something felt like a betrayal of something he couldn't name. He'd been thinking about it with both eyes open, the way he thought about fence lines and water rights and things that mattered. "We are," he said slowly, "two people who have been honest with each other from the beginning. Two people who have been through something hard together and come through it." He paused. "Two people who are better together than either of us was alone." Another pause. I believe that I want this to be permanent. But I also know that I'm not the easiest man to build a life with. I'm quiet. I have a past that occasionally sends men to my gate. I have a chair at my table that will always belong to someone else." He met her eyes. "I won't pretend those things are nothing. I want you to take them into account." Clara was very quiet. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "I'm telling you where I stand," he said, "so you can decide where you stand." She looked at him for a long time. "The chair doesn't frighten me," she said. "Your past doesn't frighten me. Your quiet doesn't frighten me. I grew up quiet. I built myself out of quiet." She folded her hands on the table. "What frightens me is waking up in that back room in 6 months and not knowing whether I'm here because you want me here or because I'm useful." "Clara, I need to say it," she said. "I've been in situations where I was valued for what I produced, and the moment I stopped producing, the valuation disappeared. I need to know that what you feel for me is separate from what I do for you." He looked at her directly. "You could burn every meal for a month," he said. "You could let the garden die and the curtains fall and never repair a single thing again. And I would still want you sitting across that table." He held her gaze. "What I feel for you has nothing to do with the bread." She pressed her lips together. "Say the rest," she said. "Whatever you're holding back, say it." He breathed in. "I love you," he said. "That's the rest." The word landed in the room with the specific weight of something that has been true for a while and is only now being admitted. Clara looked at him. Her eyes were bright. She didn't look away. "I love you too," she said. "I have for at least a month and it terrified me." He let out a breath. "Why didn't you say anything?" he said. "Why didn't you?" she said. He almost laughed. It came out as that sound, that short, reluctant, genuine exhale that was his version of it. "Fair," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand. Not carefully, not tentatively, just took it, the way she'd finally learned to take the things that were hers. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Tell your sister the truth," he said. "All of it," she said. "Start with the part where you're well and happy and settled," he said. "The rest can come in person." She looked at him. "In person?" "I thought," he said, carefully, "that come spring, when the weather allows, we might ride to St. Louis." He paused. "You said she named her daughter Clara." Her grip on his hand tightened. "You'd come to St. Louis," she said. "I've never been," he said. "I've also never met your sister." Both of those things seem worth correcting. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Elias Whitaker, Clara Bennett. That is the kindest thing anyone has ever offered me," she said. He looked down at their joined hands. "Then you've been offered too little," he said quietly. She brought her other hand up and covered his. "We're going to fix that," she said. "Yeah," he said, "we are." She wrote the letter that evening. He sat by the fire and read, and occasionally she asked him how to phrase something, and he offered words, and she used some of them and improved the rest. And by the time she sealed it, the fire had burned low, and the night had come full around the cabin, and it felt, the whole evening, the whole ordinary living shape of it, like something he had almost stopped believing was available to him. A life, a real one, with another person in it. He looked at the sealed letter on the table. He looked at Clara, who was putting the ink away with the focused tidiness she brought to everything. He looked at the chair at the end of the table. And then he looked at the chair across from his own, the one she sat in every meal, every evening, every time they found themselves at the table together. He thought, there are enough chairs. There have always been enough chairs. It was the understanding that finally arrived fully, not the beginning of it, not the approach of it, but the thing itself, settled and clear. That grief doesn't require you to stay inside it. That love lost doesn't revoke your right to love again. That Margaret would not have wanted the chair to mean no one else ever sat at the table. He knew that. He had always known it. He had just needed time, and trouble, and a woman who arrived barefoot and bleeding and honest, to believe it. 3 weeks later, Helen Greer came to the ranch, alone. No committee, no performance of concern. Just Helen Greer on a horse, arriving at the gate on a Wednesday afternoon, asking Clara if she had a moment. Clara opened the gate. They sat on the porch. Elias stayed inside not because he was asked to, but because he understood, the way he'd learned to understand Clara's silences, that this was hers to handle. He heard them through the open window, without meaning to. "I owe you an apology," Helen said. "The visit I made with the others." "The things I implied you were concerned," Clara said. "I understand that. I was prying," Helen said, "and I was unkind. And then I watched you, both of you, handle Calvin Mercer with more dignity and more intelligence than most men in this territory would have managed with a gun in each hand." A pause. "You're not what I assumed. Most people aren't," Clara said. "No," Helen agreed, "they're not." Another pause. "I'd like to start again. If you're willing a beat." "I make bread on Thursdays," Clara said. "Come Thursday if you want. Bring whoever you like." Helen Greer came Thursday. She brought 2 women. One was the younger one from the first visit, whose name was Dora, and who had, it turned out, been suppressing a smile the entire first visit, because she'd found Clara's composure magnificent and hadn't known how to say so. The other was a woman named Iris, who ran the schoolhouse in Ridgecross, and had opinions about everything and expressed them with the cheerful directness of someone who has stopped caring whether opinions are convenient. The kitchen was loud in a way it had never been loud before. Elias went to the barn. He came back 2 hours later, and there were 4 women at his table drinking coffee and eating Clara's bread, and Iris was mid-sentence about the new county road, and Dora was laughing at something, and Helen was leaning forward with the expression of someone genuinely engaged, and Clara was in the middle of all of it with the particular warmth of a woman who has been cold for a long time and is learning slowly not to be suspicious of warmth. He stood in the doorway. Clara looked up and caught his eye. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look was enough, just a brief, private, completely unguarded look that said, "Look at this. Look at what is happening here." He looked at it. He tipped his chin in acknowledgement and went to pour himself coffee. Iris turned immediately. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "I've heard you know the southern fence line better than anyone in the valley. Is it true what they're saying about the county road survey?" He sat down at the table. "Depends what they're saying," he said. "That they're routing it 2 miles east of where it should be," she said. "Completely impractical. I've written to the county office 3 times. 3 times, he said. 3, she said firmly. "I intend to write a 4th. He looked at Clara. She was looking at her coffee cup with the expression of someone trying very hard not to smile. "Tell me about the survey," he said. The afternoon went on. The Henderson family came for supper the following Sunday, all of them, including the eldest boy who'd ridden to Helena, and the youngest, who was 6 and had never seen a ranch as large as the Whitaker property, and spent most of the evening asking Elias questions about the horses with the relentless focused energy of a child who has found a subject he intends to master. Elias answered every single question. Clara watched from across the room and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten the word for it. Not happiness exactly, though it was that too. Something more specific. The feeling of being in the right place at the right time with the right people, which sounds simple and is in fact the rarest thing in the world. She thought about the road she'd walked to get here. 11 days, barefoot for the last 3. The gate at the end of a dusty road with a sign she'd almost walked past because she'd trained herself after too many disappoints not to hope too loudly. She was glad she hadn't walked past. She was glad she'd pushed the gate open. She was glad for every barefoot step on every hard road that had brought her to the moment she was standing in right now. The Henderson boy, the youngest one, looked up from his interrogation of Elias and said, with the sudden topic changes that characterize 6-year-olds, "Is she your wife?" He pointed at Clara. The room went briefly still. Elias looked at the boy. Then he looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. There was a beat, one of those beats that contains more than beats usually do, and then Elias said, in the completely level tone of a man who has made up his mind about something and is saying it out loud for the first time, "Not yet." The boy thought about this. "Why not yet?" "Because I haven't asked her properly," Elias said. "And some things deserve to be done properly." Clara felt the warmth move through her from her sternum outward, the way warmth does when it's real and not performed. She turned back to the dishes she'd been drying, but she was smiling. She let herself smile fully, at the wall above the basin, where nobody could see it except her. The Henderson family rode home. The cabin went quiet. Elias cleared the last of the table. Clara was finishing the dishes. The fire was low. The evening had the good, exhausted quality of a day that had been fully used. He came and stood beside her. She handed him a dish to dry without looking. He dried it. They worked like that for a few minutes, the small, mundane, completely ordinary choreography of two people who have learned the shape of each other in a kitchen. "Not yet," she said. "Not yet," he confirmed. "Is there a timeline?" she said. Very carefully, studying the dish she was washing. "I have something I need to do first," he said. "What?" "Get a ring," he said. "Like I said, some things deserve to be done properly." She stopped washing. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the dish he was drying. There was color at the edge of his jaw that she'd never seen before, a very slight warmth across the skin of a man who is not accustomed to being seen saying the things he's saying. "Elias," she said. "Clara, if you're going to ask," she said, "I don't need a ring first." He looked up. "I want to do it right," he said. "You've been doing it right since the first night," she said. "You stepped aside and opened the door. That was you doing it right." She held his gaze. "You can ask whenever you're ready. The answer is already yes." He looked at her. The dish sat forgotten in his hand. He set it down. He turned to face her, fully, not performing, not preparing a speech, just being exactly as present as he was capable of being, which was more than most people managed on their best days. "Clara Bennett," he said. "Not as a cook. Not as someone who fixes what's broken and makes things better and thinks 3 steps ahead of every problem. Just will you stay? As my wife." Her eyes were bright. "Yes," she said, simply, without hesitation, the same way she'd pushed through the gate the first day, direct and certain and unafraid of what came next. He took her hand. She let him. They stood in the kitchen of the Whitaker Ranch on an October evening in the Montana Territory, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, because what had just been said was enough and needed the space to settle. Then he said quietly, "I'm going to get the ring." She laughed. Real full, the kind she'd been learning to use more freely since she arrived here. "Get the ring," she agreed. He went to Ridgecross the following Thursday. Franklin's store didn't carry rings, it wasn't that kind of store, but Franklin knew a woman named Addie who did fine metalwork on the side and whose husband had been buying her out of inventory for 30 years and therefore kept her well stocked. He came home with a plain silver band, thin and clean, nothing elaborate. He showed it to Clara that evening. She looked at it in his palm. "It's perfect," she said. "It's simple," he said. "That's the same thing," she said. He put it on her finger. It fit. He didn't know how it fit, he'd guessed from memory, from the hands he'd watched move through his kitchen for 3 months, but it fit. She looked at it on her hand. He looked at her looking at it. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay," he said. The wedding was in November, before the hard winter set in. It was small, the Hendersons, Helen Greer, Dora Iris, Franklin from the general store, and a preacher from Ridgecross who had been asked before by 3 different people whether he'd be willing to ride out to the Whitaker Ranch, and had said yes, each time with the enthusiastic certainty of a man who enjoys a good story. Clara wore a dress that Dora and Helen had quietly collaborated on, blue, like the dress she'd arrived in, but not faded. New, properly blue. She'd cried when she saw it, just briefly. Then she'd pressed her hands to her face, breathed, composed herself, and said, "Thank you," to both of them with the directness that was entirely hers. Elias stood outside the cabin in his good coat and watched her walk toward him across the yard and felt he would say later, if asked. And he was not a man given to poetry. He felt like the morning after a very long night. The particular quality of the light, when you've been in the dark so long, you forgot what light looked like. She reached him. She took his arm. "You look terrified," she said very quietly. "I am terrified," he said. "Doesn't mean I'm not sure." She squeezed his arm. "Me too," she said. They turned to the preacher. And they were married in the yard of the Whitaker Ranch on a November morning, with the valley around them, and the people who had chosen them standing close, and the empty chair inside the cabin at the end of the table, where it would always be. And it was not a small thing disguised as a small thing. It was exactly as large as it was a man and a woman who had each carried grief like ballast and had slowly, carefully, without quite meaning to, put it down together. After the food and the voices and the Hendersons' youngest asking 11 more questions about horses and Iris, giving a 4-minute opinion on the proper way to preserve a garden through winter, and Franklin shaking Elias's hand for a long time. Without speaking, because some men say the important things that way. After all of it, when everyone had ridden home and the cabin was quiet again, they sat together on the front porch. Clara leaned against him. He put his arm around her. They looked at the valley going quiet and dark around them. The old wooden sign was still nailed to the gatepost at the end of the road, the one he'd hammered in with shaking hands on a morning that felt like a lifetime ago. He'd written new words on it 2 weeks back, after asking her if she thought it was time. She'd said yes without looking up from the bread she was making. He'd gone out and written it himself, and come back in, and she'd handed him coffee, and that was that. Now the sign at the gate of the Whitaker Ranch read, in Elias Whitaker's plain, "Deliberate hand." "Home found here." Clara shifted against him. "Are you happy?" she said. He looked at the sign. He thought about the locket, still in his breast pocket, always in his breast pocket, always Margaret. Always carried. And he thought about the blue dress and the ring and the 6-year-old boy asking too many questions about horses and the bread on Thursdays and the curtain hung right and the garden that had grown from dead ground and the letter that had come back when he'd carried it to town in his pocket next to the locket, next to everything he thought he'd lost. Yes, he said, simple, unguarded, true. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. Because a man who has learned to live in silence knows the difference between the silence of emptiness and the silence of fullness. And what sat around them now in the yard, in the cabin behind them, in the valley spreading south and west and into the long Montana dark was the second kind. Full, completely, finally, irreversibly full. He had nailed a sign to a gate with shaking hands and expected nothing. What arrived changed everything. And the most feared gunslinger in 3 counties sat on his own porch with his wife beside him in the dark, and he was at last exactly what he had never believed he would be again. He was home.